All right, we have a little mood music. We have a little mood music to start the evening. All right. So public notice of this meeting pursuant to the Open Public Meetings Act has been given by the board secretary in the following manner. Posted notice on the school bulletin board at the administration building, transmitted to the Courier Post, Philadelphia Inquirer, and the clerk of Cherry Hill Township. Please join me in rising for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mrs. Sugars, would you do roll call?
Mrs. Arroyo. Mrs. Stratton.
Here.
Mrs. Fleischer.
Here.
Ms. Friedel.
Here.
Mr. Mayor.
Here.
Dr. Rude.
Here.
Mrs. Stern. Mrs. Tong.
Here.
Mr. Avadia.
Here. Okay, we're going to move forward to public comment. Before that, I'm going to read a statement. Cherry Hill is a community that values education, and educational topics often bring out passionate response. The Cherry Hill Board of Education supports a school climate in which our diversity is a source of strength and all are included. Respect is foundational in how we treat you, how we treat each other, and how we support our administration and staff in their essential work. Please join us in practicing the utmost respect for all. And with that, we will start in the room with public comment. Please say your name and municipality. And feel free to begin.
My name is Ed Dodd. I live on Douglas Drive in Kingston. Members of the school board, I implore you to keep Carusi Middle School as a sending school for Kingston Elementary. I have seen and heard at board meetings various members express enthusiasm for option number 3 in middle school redistricting, which would result in Kingston Elementary being assigned to Beck Middle School. While I cannot be 100% certain of this, it appears that option 3 is being favored because it will increase the socioeconomic diversity at Beck, while of course doing nothing to alleviate the very real problem of racial diversity at Beck, which would remain under the plan 61% white. While the board's goals here are admirable, I would ask you to consider the other side of the equation. As a resident of Kingston for 17 years, I very much value the diverse and inclusive neighborhood I live in, the one that you're in right now. I value this, and I value the schools that my 4th grade daughter and my 11th grade son have attended at Kingston, Carusi, and West. The rich, diverse school experience that I had hoped my daughter would have in middle school would be completely lost if she is bused across town to Beck Middle School, all in the name of giving students of Cooper, Hart, Stockton, and Sharp exposure to the diversity my daughter already enjoys. That option 3 is even being considered, given that it would result in long bus rides back and forth to Beck for 3 years for my daughter and every other child in Kingston for years to come, tells me that exposing East Side students to the diversity we treasure here on the West Side is considered far more important than the Kingston children continuing to experience the diverse world they already enjoy. I have treasured my children's experience at West Side as West Side students precisely because they get to experience life as it exists in the real world. Now it seems the board wants to help East Side parents' children experience the real world, but not at the cost of busing East Side students here to the West Side. No, it would be at the cost of my daughter and the children of Kingston for years to come to be forced to go to the East Side for middle school, when Carusi is literally a 4-minute drive from our neighborhood. I am infuriated, but not surprised, that Kingston would be used as a pawn in this board's attempt to make East Side children experience diversity. I bought and stay in Kingston because I value the community that lives here. To rip this community apart, to send its diverse students to the East Side, just so that the socioeconomic diversity percentages tick up at Beck, would be a needless, senseless, destructive tragedy. If the Kingston community is ripped apart to serve the needs of the East Side schools, it will not be forgotten by the voters of Kingston when the time comes to approve a bond or re-elect current school board members. I urge you to keep Carusi Middle School as a sending school for Kingston Elementary.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. All right, seeing no additional public comment, we will resume our business of the evening with HIB training that Mrs. Wethington will deliver.
Thank you, Mr. Vadia. Dr. Mahan is going to move the slides forward for me. Before we start, I just want to go over what you have in my packet. I think Mrs. Sugars also gave you a packet. So you have the presentations, you can take notes. You have what I think is really a terrific FAQ from the Department of Education. You have the regulations governing HIB, and then you have our district policy on HIB. All the HIB reading that you could want. Okay. That's all right. Dr. Mahan is gonna get us powered up. I'm just gonna talk a little bit about process. I have on the agenda 45 minutes, so the presentation should not take more than 30. I'm gonna ask you to please hold your questions until we're finished because I've allotted about 15 minutes for questions. That should be sufficient. Okay? All right, Dr. Mahan. You can go, yeah. So we'll be talking today about the anti-bullying rights law. The version that we will be talking about is the one that was adopted in 2011. I just want to give you a historical perspective. So the first anti-bullying rights or bullying law in New Jersey was created in 2002. At that time, New Jersey had one of the most comprehensive bullying laws in the country, and the focus was on schools adopting bullying policies. In 2007, some of you may remember a big case in Toms River where a student was bullied due to his sexual orientation. The family felt that the district had not done enough, and that case went to state court, Superior Court, and then the Supreme Court. That brought bullying back into the spotlight in New Jersey. So the state of New Jersey created a commission on bullying in 2008. That commission developed a report in 2009 and made recommendations that required districts to change their policies. And then came 2010, and I'm sure a lot of you remember the student at Rutgers who took his life based on bullying. So in 2011, there was a new HIB law introduced, actually in 2010, signed by the governor in 2011, which is the version that we're talking about today. And that was implemented for the first time in the 11-12 academic year. So the purpose of that law, sorry, Dr. Mahan, was to establish clearer standards for HIB, to strengthen prevention, reporting, and investigating. And then it was also hoped to address the risk of suicide. Department of Ed has addressed the anti-bullying rights law into different elements: preventing bullying, reporting bullying, investigating bullying, responding, and then remediating. Okay. All right. So when I think of bullying, I always think, and I'm dating myself, of Back to the Future many years ago, and Biff, who was bullying / torturing. You know, if you remember the movie, he asked for a tab, which again, you have to be a certain age to remember a tab. I remember. So when I train new teachers during new teacher orientation, I ask them, like, what is bullying? And they're normally sitting together, and I have them define it and then share with their seat partners, like, what is bullying? And everyone has in their mind's eye, like, a picture of a bully. 9 times out of 10, whatever they've identified does not align with the anti-bullying rights law in New Jersey. We're having a little technical issue. We're just gonna hold on one. Okay, there we go. Okay, so there's a big difference between the common use of bullying, AKA Biff and Back to the Future, and the legal definition. If I spend any time talking about HIB, it's typically with parents who are frustrated because we have determined an incident does not meet the criteria. They believe their child has been bullied, and there's really a disconnect. So that common versus the legal definition is really a source of contention. So under the ABR, one of the most essential elements is that the incident has to be motivated by an actual or perceived characteristic. And there's lots of areas that can be addressed: race, color, sexual orientation, gender identity, but there's got to be a distinguishing characteristic or it absolutely will not meet the criteria for HIB under this law. The incident has to take place on school property or a school-sponsored function, on the school bus, in some cases off school grounds. That's pretty specific criteria. And then it has to substantially disrupt or interfere with the operations of the school or the rights of students. A reasonable person would have to know that the incident could cause harm and or was insulting or demeaning and or creates a hostile educational environment. So most of the characteristics defined in the statute are also protected characteristics under federal law. New Jersey also has its own law against discrimination known as NJ-LAD, which is much broader than the federal definition and includes additional characteristics like hair or sexual orientation. And then there is a broader interpretation. So at some point on the continuum, the Commissioner of Education may make a decision about a case that's been heard at the board level, and the commissioner can overturn or uphold the board's determination. So these are a couple additional categories that have been found to meet the criteria based on commissioner decisions. So when anti-bullying specialists are in the middle of an investigation, one of the core elements they have to ascertain is, was there a substantial disruption? So as they're doing that, in some cases, it's very clear and they can make that determination very easily. In other cases, they have to ask a series of questions, and I've just highlighted some of the questions they may ask or other information they may seek to make that determination. So 2018 was the first big amendment to the HIB law since 2011, and there were lots of changes. So prior to 2018, we would advise staff, if you hear the words harass, bully, or intimidate, you must investigate. And then in 2018, there was the approval to do a pre-assessment, also called a threat assessment, where the building, the principal in particular, can look at the fact pattern and decide should the building investigate. The amendment also addressed the role of approved private schools with disabilities. Prior to that amendment, the district was not responsible for investigating incidents that involve students with disabilities in approved private school, on the school bus, on school property, or during a school-sponsored function. So in 2018, that changed, and now that is our responsibility. We do not investigate incidents that occur at the approved private school. Anything outside of that, we do investigate. We were also given pretty explicit direction about ways that we are able to notify parents of an incident. So if an incident occurs and it happens to be about a student's sexual orientation and the student has not made that known to their families, we are legally prohibited from sharing that with parents. So that was defined explicitly in the amendment. It's the same for gender identity. We may not reveal that information to parents. Prior to the amendments, a parent could ask for an appeal at any point. They could do it a year out, 2 years out, 3 years out. In 2018, the legislature changed that timeline to 60 days. The school safety team was renamed the School Safety and Climate Team. Their role was essentially the same, although the law did clarify that they may not review confidential student information. You may hear in lots of HIB presentations the concept of power imbalance. So it's not a criteria under the ABR, but it could be a consideration if there is a distinguishing characteristic as part of that investigation. The conflict of interest addresses our anti-bullying specialists are also CHEA members, so they may not conduct an investigation where another member of their bargaining unit is the offender. That has never been the practice in Cherry Hill. If a staff member is the offender, the principal always investigates here. And then for students with disabilities, we just need to consider the nature of the disability when thinking about remediating behavior. And then 2021, more amendments. So this set of amendments really talks about legal options in the case of cyber harassment, potential fines for parents for failing to comply with court orders, and potential civil liability for parents as well. It also discusses parameters for incidents with the same student that are first, second, or subsequent acts. So you'll see for first and second offenses, it's pretty similar. For third offenses, the principal would have to develop a student plan. We would certainly have that happen in collaboration with the ABS or counselors. And then we have an agreement, which I believe you're familiar with law enforcement, and we have reporting obligations under that MOA. So we have an HIB policy that is in your packet. It is required. It does align with the code of conduct. And I expect that we're going to see changes to that policy in a future board cycle based on the amendments that occurred in 2021. We have not received an update from Strauss Esme, who does our policies on our behalf. So I'm anticipating we'll get something from them probably this spring, modifying the policy to align with the new 2021 amendments. So we have multiple reporting requirements for HIB. First is a self-assessment. You've heard me talk about that before. We also call them the HIB grades. You approve those in December, I do believe. We do that yearly. The anti-bullying specialist, in conjunction with the school safety team, assesses how well they're implementing the law. The HIB trainings and programs comes out of my office, along with the building staff. The anti-bullying specialists report how many times they've trained staff, how many programs they're implementing for students in the building, and we do that report twice a year. And then Mr. Saporito does the annual violence and vandalism report, and we document in that report the number of HIB incidents that were affirmed. Staff also have an obligation to report. Again, when we train staff, we tell them that the obligation to report HIB is as serious as their obligation to report child abuse. It is significant, and if they hear that language or hear a story or a description that could meet that standard, they must report. They do not have any options. So we will train our full and part-time staff. We have contractors. Some of them take advantage of our training. Some of them train their own staff. We also train volunteers. For new staff, we train them during new teacher orientation every August. We also provide required PD for staff. The anti-bullying specialists provide HIB prevention in their staff meetings with their staff. They get far more than 2 hours of instruction every 5 years. And then we provide explicit instruction on suicide and HIB prevention through a mental health specialist for staff, for sure, 2 hours every 5 years. We are also required to have an option to report anonymously. The platform that we use is Stop It. So every building in the district has a Stop It code that is unique to that building. Some buildings change their code on a yearly basis, others keep the code the same. Students and staff and parents can download the Stop It app. You can get it in either the Apple Store, if you have an Android, the Android store, and report any incident anonymously. It is monitored by the administrators in the building. It is not monitored 24/7. Multiple requirements in HIB. The next requirement, anti-bullying coordinator, that would be my role, one of my roles. Primary functions are coordinating district policy. We take the lead on data reporting to Department of Ed. I'm required to meet with the anti-bullying specialist twice a year. We far surpass that obligation. And then we're also required to have anti-bullying specialists. They chair the school safety team. They are the lead on every HIB investigation. That's their statutory requirement. The principal is not the lead as per statute. It's the anti-bullying specialist. And they are the person in the building officially responsible for addressing HIB. In Cherry Hill, we are lucky to have one ABS for every school. That has not always been the case. That changed maybe 4 years ago. We had shared anti-bullying specialists in a few schools. We don't have that anymore. At the elementary level, there are school counselors. At the secondary level, there are SACs. They all have pretty significant HIB training, but they're not criminal investigators. These are not criminal investigations. These are HIB complaints. And that is just one of the many responsibilities that they have in the school building. We also are required to have school safety and climate teams in every building. They are looking at the school climate from a global perspective. They must meet twice a year. Most teams meet more frequently than that. They will review HIB incidents as a collective. They're not reviewing student-specific incidents. They're looking at trends. For example, are we seeing incidents happening at lunchtime? Are we seeing incidents happening in a specific wing of the building or hallway? Are we seeing incidents happening at recess? They will also look at patterns. Is there a specific category or characteristic that is coming up most frequently in the building? And they will address that also. So as I said earlier, in 2018, the law was amended to permit us to pre-assess incidents of HIB. When we do that, we're assuming that everything that has been said or reported is factual and accurate, and it's not a mini investigation. The principal will use the HIB rubric to determine would the incident meet the criteria for HIB. If it would not, then we would not move forward with an investigation. Every threshold assessment is submitted electronically and reviewed by myself and Dr. Malash, and then approved by myself and Dr. Malash. All right, so now we'll get into the reporting process. And I think someone asked about where that fell in the regulation. So you'll see right under the title, that's the regulatory, that's actually the statutory citation. So anytime there is an incident that occurs, if an employee or contracted provider or even a board member sees it or is aware of it, everyone has an obligation to report. Staff must report in writing. So we have a form for staff in Hipster, which is our electronic platform. Staff have an obligation to report that. Everyone has to report it to the principal within 2 days. Board members, if you were to see or hear or get a report, the best practice is that you would report that to the superintendent, who would then report it to the principal. So we would not be allowed to pre-assess without that being permitted in our policy. Our policy does give us that latitude. And as I said earlier, we're assuming all the facts are true when we're conducting that assessment to make that determination. So as per the statute, the principal is not the lead investigator. The principal must direct the anti-bullying specialist to investigate. The anti-bullying specialist may not investigate without the direction of the principal. So the principal or the assistant principal at secondary level would be the person informing parents that there is an investigation. They would not share any additional information at that time because we don't have facts. We just know that there's an allegation. So they would share with the parent that we are initiating an investigation. They may not share the names of any other students. They do not have any additional information they would share with parents at that time. So the anti-bullying specialist initiates the investigation. The anti-bullying specialist has 10 days to complete the investigation. Then she will, and I say she because all of our anti-bullying specialists are women, will document and identify as women, will document the results in Hipster. So they will document the victim, the offender. They will upload any evidence. We may have videos, we may have photos, we may have text messages, we may have statements. We ask all students to provide statements. They can be scribed for younger students who are not writing yet or who are not comfortable writing that to that volume. All that's uploaded into Hipster. The anti-bullying specialist then does the executive summary that the board sees. Once that's completed, they will review, they will make a determination because the rubric is embedded in Hipster to see if it meets the criteria for HIB. And then they will assign it electronically to the principal. The principal then reviews the investigation, reviews the notes, reviews the statements, reviews the evidence. The principal approves the investigation and assigns it to me. I will then go in and review it again, look at the evidence, look at the statements to make sure it does meet the criteria, they have followed the rubric, everything is checked. And then I will review with Dr. Malash, who also has questions, not every time, but many times. Once we're both comfortable, we will assign it to Mrs. DeMarco in my office, who then preps the report for the board for exec session. Hipster documents everything that we do in the system. For every comma that we change, for every keystroke, every time I correct someone's spelling, it is documented in Hipster. There's a timestamp on everything that we do in that system. And we use that system for any issue that we may have legally at some point that documents everything that we do. So Dr. Malash is responsible for reporting the results to the board. As you know, I work with him to make that happen. And then the board, after the board receives the investigation notes, we will then provide written information to the parent. The letter goes out from my office. If the incident is heard on, let's say, the 22nd, the letter will go out by that Friday. So parents, as per statute, are entitled to have the nature of the investigation, whether bullying, harassment, or intimidation was found, if there were discipline or services provided. They can request a hearing before the board. They do not have the right to be present when their children are interviewed, nor do they have the right to be notified and not to be notified, to provide consent so that we can talk to their children. So when parents receive the letter, there's one more slide, I think, after my hand. When parents receive the letter, there are only a few options. Either the incident did meet the criteria for HIB, may not have met the criteria for HIB. We might say that something occurred and it's a code of conduct violation, but it's not HIB, or there was simply not enough evidence for us to make a determination. So in regard to students with disabilities, the anti-bullying rights law applies to students with disabilities in the same way that it applies to any other student. There is no separate law that addresses students with disabilities. It is, and just because a student has a disability does not mean that we would not implement all the requirements in the ABR. We would look at consequences, discipline, and remediation along with the nature of the student's disability. And if there were discipline involved, we would definitely keep that in mind from a manifestation determination perspective. And depending on the nature of the incident, we may need to engage the IEP team. So lots of conversations. I have lots of conversations with parents about what is HIB and what's not HIB. And, you know, conflict is really a common thing in any school and any family and any organization. People don't agree and they have conflict. HIB is really one-sided, where one student is the victim of another student's aggression. Dr. Malash likes to say it's developmentally appropriate, inappropriate behavior. Like, this is the place where we expect kids to make some mistakes and to be able to address that in a safe space. So we see lots of incidents that could be conflict or could be HIB. Sometimes an incident, I remember there were a few that started as conflict and then as it progressed, turned into HIB. It absolutely can happen. But HIB is primarily one-sided. Conflict is usually mutual. So that's the first thing that we say when we're looking at any kind of incident. Was there a mutual engagement between the two students? That's conflict. Sometimes it can continue into a way that becomes HIB. And just an example, Sandra is our example student. She's in a bad mood. She punches another student in the hallway. She would have punched anyone because she was just in a bad mood and did not want to be in the building that day. So that would absolutely be a code of conduct violation. It would not be HIB because there's no substantial disruption. There could be a substantial disruption, but there's no distinguishing characteristic. And without that criteria, it can never be HIB under the anti-bullying rights law. And of all the things that we've seen in some of the HIB summaries, inappropriate behavior, pretty common when we're looking at HIB, physical contact is fairly common, threats, fighting, harassment, intimidation, and bullying are all their own code of conduct violation. So an incident could be just code of conduct, it could be HIB and code of conduct, but if it's HIB, it's going to fall under the code of conduct. So I get lots of questions from parents about the HIB letter. It's actually, I think, pretty infamous. This is one of the most common questions. So every student involved, no, not every student, the victim and the offender both receive a letter from my office documenting the results of the investigation. If a student was a witness, they do not receive a letter. That letter used to be maintained in the student's cumulative folder. We changed that a few years ago. We maintain it electronically in a separate file. The people that access it are the principal, myself, and Mrs. DeMarco in my office. We do not send that letter to college. That's my number one most common question when I talk to parents. Does the letter go to college? It does not. We don't send it to anyone. And now we maintain it separately, so it's even less disturbing. So parents, of course, can request a hearing before the board. They have 60 calendar days to do that now, not school days, calendar days. They usually send the request to me and I will then schedule the hearing with the board. And then at the conclusion of the hearing, after the board makes their determination, we will send a decision to the parents in writing in collaboration with Mr. Green. And parents can always appeal their decision to the Commissioner of Education, and they could also file a complaint with the Division of Civil Rights. So I think maybe in December, there were some questions about our HIB data, and I think there were a few public comments about our HIB numbers increasing. And I think I said to the board at some point, I did not think that was accurate, and someone asked for us to run the numbers. So you can see 2017-18 was a year where we were not able to pre-assess. So for every time someone said, my child is being harassed, bullied, or intimidated, we investigated. And you'll see we were at 238. 18-19 was the first year that we could use the pre-assessment. So that number did drop to 193. Alleged means investigations. 1920 and 2021 are outliers because those were our COVID years. We did not have students in the building for 180 school days. So I don't think either of those are really comparable to real numbers. And as of January 31st, we had 95 investigations, alleged HIBs. I think we're going to be aligned with our 2018-19 numbers. Halfway through the year, halfway to 193, give or take a few numbers. So I asked the anti-bullying specialist in preparation for this presentation to share with me just some logistics about what kind of time it takes for them to investigate, how many students they're investigating, how many students they're interviewing during investigation, things they might want me to share with the board. And I'll just highlight, because I know you have already seen some of this, that they want you to know that they take the investigations very seriously and they want to make sure they have complete investigations. This is not the only thing that they do. I said we have counselors and our student assistance coordinators. So they are all student contact all day long. Like, that's why we hire them. That's why they're in the building. So for every investigation, that's taking away from other responsibilities in the building. For straightforward incidents, they may be able to get that done with the paperwork meaning hipster, in a day. For others, it may take 3 to 8 days, depending on how many witnesses. One anti-bullying specialist said she can work as many as 15 hours on a case and have 5 to 6 students involved. And one, she had 20. Sometimes they need to call the victim, the offender, and witnesses back multiple times as they're getting additional information, which is very time consuming. If the student's out on a code of conduct violation, they may be suspended. They may not be able to get a statement, which, just delays the process. And that no two investigations are alike. The time devoted really depends on the fact pattern. The HIBs that involve social media are just typically very time consuming because you're going through Instagram and Snapchat and Discord. At times there are counter HIBs, a victim and an offender may switch to different roles. Parents are frustrated. And then they also want you to know that inputting the information in the hipster, and I think that's said again, the next slide, could be very time consuming. One of the anti-bullying specialists, who I think does a bang up job with her executive summaries, shared that, she puts a lot of effort into making them clear and articulate, and she edits them because she wants to give you quality information. And again, uploading all the information in the hipster takes a lot of extra work because this is all really confidential. Some of the information that they have, i.e. a student's sexual orientation or gender identity, is not something we're going to share or defer to someone else to upload. This is all things that they are doing on their own without a lot of additional secretarial or other support or assistance. So I'm going to end and ask for your I'm thinking of the word I'm looking for. No, not for questions. Anyway, I'm going to finish with the video that's one of my favorites to share with new teachers during new teacher orientation. And I want to share it with you because the HIB process can be so divisive. For every time that we have a hearing with parents, they're frustrated. Board members may be frustrated. And I think we forget the why, like, why are we here? Why do we come to work every day? I can say for those of us at this table, we come to work every single day and we continue to come back because we love kids. We want kids to be successful. Our hopes and dreams for them are similar to the hopes and dreams that their parents have for them. And I think let's end this, as divisive as it can be, all understanding like why we do the things that we do, why you're sitting here as board volunteers and why we're sitting here as the administrative team. 3 minutes, I think you'll enjoy it. So, Mr. Vadia, I know that Mr. Adams is here. I neglected to check the time when I started, so I'm happy to answer questions. If there are any.
Yes. No, thank you, Mrs. Wellington. So, okay, yeah, so we do have a second speaker, and everyone's been kind enough to truncate two trainings into one night. Let's go around to the board table. Before I do, I mean, Mrs. Wellington's role tonight is as an educator. There's a lot to talk about with HIB that we'll do over the course of the rest of this year and for many of us beyond. But today we want to kind of, stick with the educational pieces. And I would say, everyone, pick maybe your top question or two. We'll go around and then we'll be able to move to our second order of business. Okay. Who would like to start? Mrs. Fleischer.
I actually don't have a lot of questions because I just wanted to thank Mrs. Wethington. I went over before the meeting because I sent her about 10 questions before the meeting. I want to thank you for it being so complete. And thank you for, really explaining everything to us, and having a few meetings under our belt has helped, I think. So that's, I have no additional questions, but thank you. And I did love the video very much. So thank you.
Thanks, Mrs. Fleischer.
Okay, great. Ms. Friedel.
Thank you, Mrs. Wethington, and Ms. Dr. Mahan. You did an excellent job as well. A couple of questions. All right, so if a staff member is made aware or hears of an incident, they are expected to report it to the principal that day.
Yes.
What happens if they don't? What is the process? If somebody goes forward with either the teacher heard something or it was reported to somebody, a teacher or somebody, and it doesn't go anywhere.
So if we have evidence that the staff person was aware and did not report, then we'd be having a conversation with Ms. Adrian about that.
So the parent goes to the principal, the parent goes to you, like,
The parent could talk to the principal, parent could talk to Dr. Mahan or Dr. Morton or myself.
okay. Clarification. So you had noted, or you had stated that, sorry, old eyes. You inform parents of alleged offenders and alleged victim, there's an alleged incident, and may discuss as appropriate counseling and other intervention services. I'm sorry, I'm going to try to talk into here. Now, in the administrative code, it says school district officials shall take into account the circumstances of the incident when providing notification to parents and guardians of all students involved in the reported harassment, intimidation, or bullying incident, and when conveying the nature of the incident, including the actual or perceived protected category motivating the alleged offense. I guess one of my questions is, or concerns is, that parents really are not provided with any information other than your child is the victim or your child is the alleged offender of an HIB. And an investigation ensues, and then it goes to the board, and then you get a letter saying that your child was either founded or not founded. And at no point, other than what your child chooses to tell you, are you really informed of the incident. And I'm not sure that is, when it says conveying the nature of the incident, including the actual or perceived protected category, are we meeting the regulatory requirements?
We absolutely are. So we describe the nature of the incident in the first letter that the parents received, and the category is in the letter of, I'd have to pull up the offender's letter. It's certainly in the letter of the victim, what the protected characteristic or the perceived characteristic was. We have worked with Mr. Green to refine the letter over the course of the 10 years that I've been here, and he's pretty explicit that everything that we put in there meets the letter of the law.
Okay,
It's not detailed, I don't disagree with you, but it meets our reporting criteria to parents, our reporting requirements to parents.
okay. And I have two other clarifications. So I don't know what slide number it is, but it's on page 12. It's the last slide and it's the last bullet. Incidents may be HIB first, then become conflict or vice versa. So if it goes between HIB conflict or conflict HIB, does it still get investigated as a HIB or is it now a conflict?
So I'm going to give you an example. There was an incident at a school where two students were in a fight over basketball conflict. So student A and student B are arguing, they're in each other's spaces. One's pissed at the other, one lost the basketball game, right? Still in conflict. Student A follows student B out of the gym down the hallway, still conflict. Student A calls student B the N-word. Now we're in HIB.
What happens if it's in reverse? So
We're-
it starts out the student called the student a derogatory name, but then after a few minutes, the student who was the victim now starts coming back.
So
Is it
then we
still-
start in HIB, but it could go into a conflict if it's a fight. Both students are going to
Okay.
be disciplined for code of conduct for fighting.
Okay, all right. And then I guess just for clarification, so if an incident would also, which many times they do, fall under a code of conduct issue as well, does the code of conduct issue get addressed simultaneously? Or does the HIB investigation occur and then the code of conduct goes into effect? Or is it a variety of options?
It could be a variety. It really depends on what the fact pattern is for the incident. So if there was a fight that generated out of the incident, that's going to be addressed via code of conduct right away. We can't wait for that, right? If it was something like a sexual harassment, that's going to be addressed right away. If it's student A said student B did this, we have not investigated and student B says I didn't do it, there's not going to be code of conduct because we need more information.
I have one last, and I promise this
fine.
is my last one. Witnesses.
Mhm.
What happens when there's no witnesses?
Then so if Dr. Mahan says that I did something and I say I didn't do it and there's no witnesses, then we don't have enough evidence. We will not take one student's word over the other. We don't have the ability to do that. What would make one student more credible than the other? There's just not enough evidence then.
And I think this is maybe a flaw, not necessarily within Cherry Hill's practice, but for that student who's getting harassed or bullied, but there's, the other student smart enough to do it with no witnesses, then it kind of perpetuates. So again, I'm not saying it's a flaw with
Yeah.
our implementation. It's potentially a flaw in the whole HIB policy.
I don't
It's
disagree, Ms.
statewide.
Bridell. Yeah,
Thank you.
certainly.
Mr. Mayor?
So this question may cross over into our next topic on ethics and conflicts. When it comes time for an HIB hearing for those parents that request one, in the event that a board member has a previous relationship or some knowledge or is close in some way to one of the two main parties, whether it be a victim or alleged offender, is there guidance with regard to whether or not that member should or should not participate in the hearing or participate and simply abstain at the time of a vote? Or is that something that, for instance, if I know one or both of the parties, but still feel that I could be fair with respect to hearing all of the information, is that something that I might discuss individually with board solicitor before determining whether or not I or another board member, if they were in the same position, would have an obligation ethically to abstain or participate in the hearing?
So I'm going to start and then ask Mrs. Sugars if she has anything else to add, or Mr. Avadia. So I think most board members would talk to Mr. Green and they would discuss to see if they should recuse themselves. I think the bulk of the times he has said, Mrs. Sugars and Mr. Avadia, correct me if I'm wrong, if you know them, you could still participate. His standard for recusal is I don't want to say flexible, that's not accurate, but he tries to make sure that you can participate in the board processes. Certainly, if it was a relative, you would not have a choice but to recuse yourself. But I think as a practice, the board has discussed that with Mr. Green and they've made a determination.
Thank you.
And I think one of the issues sometimes is you don't know until the parent walks into the room because you're not given information about who the family is prior to the hearing. So sometimes you're in the hearing and somebody walks in and now you need to make a decision about, do I need to leave or not? So it has to be your comfort level, other than, as Mrs. Wethington said, if it's a family member, but if this is a child that's, sitting around your kitchen table, or, parents that you see, you may want to excuse yourself. But if it's just a kid that was on your child's team, that might be different.
Yeah, I sort of concur. I would say if there's a financial relationship, if there's something like that. But a lot of times I remember a previous board president said, I know these people, I'm going to see them socially. I don't want the responsibility of, this. And frankly, you have a full board, and when we act as a full board. So if there's a piece of you that says, no, none of these guys a long time, I know some of the things at play, I think I would almost defer to, your own comfort level, own individual. But if there's anything, it's easy to walk out, say, it is too close. And, I guess I'm a err on the side of caution guy, but maybe you're not. So, it's, but there is a line, but sometimes when it's explicit, it's absolutely explicit. Then there can be degrees of freedom. So we can talk more about it. But Paul is absolutely our solicitor and a great resource, if there's a specific thing. And, even if we have to take an extra second to make the, like if someone walks in the room, you still might want to sidebar Paul for a moment and just say, here's the situation. Let's make a quick call. It's worth that extra moment if you have a question.
Okay, thank you. Got it.
Dr. Root?
Sure. I just have one point I want to clarify. I just want to make sure I heard correct. Parents do not have the right to demand to be present for an interview. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And also parental consent to interview the kids anyway is not required either.
Correct. We do
Okay.
not need consent to talk to children. We talk to them all day long.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's just an important thing for us to be aware of. I know it's something that I've heard and parents say, and I just wanted to make sure I understood it correctly. About what parents are told, how closely is the material provided to us given to parents? Like how much, because I feel like there have been instances where the parents didn't seem very well informed about the
Dr.
incident.
Dr. Rude, that kind of goes back to what Ms. Friedel was talking about. Parents do not get a lot of detail. They're not entitled to a lot of detail. That's the nature of the law and the process.
Okay.
We have, in response to some board concerns, started to give parents the parent report that we generate out of Hipster. Again, there's not a lot of detail because it's really student information
Okay.
in that report. So that has to all be redacted. I can't give you information about another parent's child.
Yeah.
So it's not a lot of detail. That's accurate. And,
Okay.
and I could see parents could be frustrated.
Yeah, I see the difficulty there with trying to maintain students' privacy. But I just wanted to make sure I understood your explanation. And then in terms of the one-on-one incident where there's no witnesses and you're not able to, it doesn't reach a HIB because there's not enough evidence. Where do those, those incidents are still considered under code of conduct, are they not? Or
It depends on the fact pattern. So if there was a fight that generated out of that, but there was a student said that there was inappropriate language that came out of the fight, there may be code of conduct for the fight, but not for the inappropriate language if we can't document that happened.
Okay.
So it really depends on the fact pattern, but oftentimes a student will say this happened. The other student will say, I didn't do it. There's no video because we'd always check the video first. There's no video, there's no one else who was around, no one else heard or saw anything, and there may not be a history between the two students to fall back on. So
Okay.
in that incident, we would just say there was not enough information for us to make a determination.
Okay, and I've heard the video like documentation a few times. Do videos, do they also have auditory? Like, are they visual and sound?
So we're actually talking about two different types of videos. When I talk about video in that context, we have video that we can look at in the buildings that does not have audio.
Okay,
But parents often or students often have video of events on their phones that they will share with us and that get uploaded into Hipster. And sometimes we can see everything.
Okay.
So there's two different types of video that we're talking about.
okay. Thank you for all those clarifications. I
Sure.
appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Okay, so it looks like the last question on this will go to me. And it's not really so much of a question, but one of the things that does pain me a little bit, and I just think is that I think parents sometimes have the concern, my kid's not a bad kid, right? Like they're not, like, don't give up on this kid. And I think there's also the piece of it about like, yeah, like, is this going to follow them around forever? You say it's not, but and I think it's sort of that labeling and that piece. So I guess I would just ask you to, I know you covered it, but just, what is our response to those two issues of like this whole issue of, the sort of like labeling forever in our system. And then this issue of, will it follow them, the rest of the days of their lives?
So those are probably two of the most common conversations that I have with parents. I had two conversations of that nature today, just so you know. And I always say to parents, kids make mistakes. I have 4 children, all 4 make tons of mistakes, right? Like that's the nature of life. It doesn't mean they're bad. We would never call a child bad. It means they made a mistake. And guess what? You can recover. Like one mistake doesn't define your whole life. That's what we have to teach kids. Like make the mistake, recover from it, learn from the recovery. Like it's not a label. It is as much of a label as we allow it to be a label. Like we've got to help our kids get past it. And sometimes I think respectfully, I'm a mother of 4, we get more heightened than the children do. So I think it's for us as adults to set the standard because it can be very frustrating. I can understand that. But there's no perfect child, there's no perfect adult, and we've got to let kids make mistakes and then recover from them. It's not a long time, anything. It's a letter and a file at the end of the day. And I don't say that to sound dismissive because I've talked to many parents who have been very, very, very upset. We don't send it anywhere. We don't share it with many people at this point. The principal sees it, I see it, Mrs. DeMarco in my office sees it. So we try to contain it so that it doesn't have the impact that parents are nervous and upset about. And that's as much as I can do to kind of try and mitigate some of their concerns.
Thank you. And thank you for this presentation.
You're welcome.
For future board members, this is probably good, like after November and before January. So we'll see. We may syndicate it, and actually, I mean, YouTube allows you to monetize, right? Alternative funding in our back pocket. Without further ado, I will introduce Mr. Jesse Adams, who is our representative with New Jersey School Boards Association, and who will tell you about his history, which is long and storied, and great advocate for boards and board process. But tonight we will turn our attention to the ever important and essential piece of board ethics. And so without further ado, Mr. Adams.
I'm assuming you're recording, streaming, or whatever, correct? So use the mic. Gotcha. All right. Good evening, everyone. Happy new board year. We're here tonight to talk about ethics. As you know, annually, there's one mandatory training that the full board has to go through each year, and that's a discussion on the School Ethics Act. And for those who may not know, a lot of boards in the state think that when they have reorganization and the one resolution where everyone says we work and abide by the code of ethics, the 10 tenets, and we pass that resolution, we've met our annual requirement. the 10 tenets of the Code of Ethics for Board Members is one paragraph in the entire School Ethics Act. So the intent of the law and of CUSAC is not just to know the 10 tenets, but you should have a discussion regarding the whole act. And so that's what we do routinely. It's the hot topic, January, February, March. You know, I probably could recite it all in my sleep now, you know, but that's what usually is this time of year. New boards, new board members, everybody wants to get on the same page as far as ethics go, so as they move forward into the year. So don't want this to be a one-way conversation. So if you've got questions, throw them out wherever we're at. And if there's something in the presentation that's going to cover it, I'll let you know that. If not, I'll answer it right away. But please, this is your training. And I'm assuming all of you can see everything I'm doing on the screen. All right. Where do I point? Back there. Oh, there you go. All right. So the act itself came into being in 1992. I don't know how many of you were board members back in 1992. I was. I spent 22 years as a board member. That was my first year as a board member. Had a vacancy. They came and said, hey, we think you'd be good on the board. It's only one meeting a month. Why don't you apply? I applied, got on, and realized they lied to me. It's more than one meeting a month. But the act came into being in 92, and it was the result of a lot of stuff that was happening in the state of New Jersey as it related to board members, superintendents, business administrators, you name it. 70s and 80s for some, you know, I don't believe anybody was there back then as it related to board business, but there was a lot of things like nepotism going on. Some districts, every board member had relatives working in the district. It was a job factory, for lack of a better term. Superintendents, they had some pretty interesting contracts back then. Some of them had clothing allowances, cars, you know, any kind of perk you might think could be in the private sector. There were some superintendents who had those perks in their contracts. There was a lot of misuse of government fund taxpayer dollars going on. I'll give you one example. Back then, there was a board, North Jersey Board, National School Boards Association. They hold their annual national conference every year in the April timeframe, first week or so in April. And they hold it in some pretty desolate places like San Francisco, San Diego, New Orleans, you know, Orlando. Well, this North Jersey board, this one year, it was the conference was in San Francisco. The board flew the entire board, all 9 members, plus the superintendent and the BA, all flew out to San Francisco for the conference. This was in April. This was back when elections were in April as well, latter part of April. So this board went out there. You want to give them the benefit of the doubt that they attended all the different workshops and stuff, but you know, they don't know if they did. They spent the 4.5 days out there, flew back. A week later, the April elections took place. 3 of those board members were up for re-election, but they had not filed petitions. They weren't running again. So elections take place. Back then it was April. The last week is reorganization. Those 3 members were no longer board members, but the taxpayers paid for a trip to San Francisco for those 3 plus the other board members. Well, somebody in the district dropped a dime to the Star Ledger. And you know how that goes. It made the papers and it was an ugly incident. Those are the kind of things that were coming up in the newspapers on a routine basis. So the public was up in arms with board members, with superintendents, you know, with the way their taxpayer dollars are being used. And they complained to their legislators. And the legislature said, we can solve this. They passed the School Ethics Act. I will tell you all that board members are the most monitored, trained, and governed elected officials in the state of New Jersey. And you all get paid very well for that privilege, right? So the act itself came into being, and the bottom line, when you look at the School Ethics Act, it basically is saying that you are the elected officials. Nothing you do, say, or any actions you take should ever break the public's trust or give the perception that you're breaking the public's trust. That's in a nutshell what those 9 pages of the act basically say. The other piece that I will point out is that I get, November election, I get a lot of calls in December from newly elected board members. They go to the website, they say, I'm from, Burlington County, who's the field rep? They find your FSR and they find me and they call me. I'm a newly elected. I'm going to be going to reorganization in January. I have no clue what I'm getting into. Can you tell me how I can get up to speed before I actually show up for reorganization in January? I always tell new board members 2 things. One, if you want to know how your board operates, go to the policy manual. In the policy manual, there's 2 sections, the policies and the bylaws. The bylaws are how your board has decided they want to operate. Whether they're operating that way may be a different story, but that's the purpose of the bylaws. That tells the board, the public, everyone, how this board does business. So I tell new members, if nothing else, read those bylaws before you get to the reorg. The second thing I tell them is go to the DOE website and pull up the School Ethics Act. It's not a heavy read. Like I said, when you print it out, it's only 9 pages. That's a light statute. So read that, and it gives you standards and guidelines that you're expected to execute to as a board member. So I tell those new folks, if you read that and at least understand going in what the ethical expectations are, and you understand, you've read the bylaws, so you know what your board is supposedly doing and how they operate, then you at least have a running start for reorganization. So it's important. And the veterans, you may not realize it, but that's where your foundation is. And it's not a guideline or something that we'd like you to do. It's the law. The other piece, that other question I always get from different board members is charter schools. What's the deal with charter schools? Do those folks who are sitting on those boards have the same responsibilities as we do? And the answer is yes. The School Ethics Act specifically identifies the fact that this is applicable to charter schools and charter trustees. Trustees is just a fancy word that charters use for board members. All right, so, but they are required to abide by the same standards and the same School Ethics Act that all of you do. Because remember, in New Jersey, charter schools are public schools. They're governed, managed by the DOE, and they get public funds. They get 90% of every child that comes out of your district and goes to them, comes out of your budget. All right, so they're public schools, and the act applies to those trustees as well. CUSAC, the state monitoring system. 5 indicators, one of them is governance. I'm sorry, 5 areas of performance, one of them is governance. Governance is you. The area of governance, all the 14 indicators are measuring you as a board and what you do. Side commercial, I always tell boards, you understand CUSAC. In each of the 5 areas, you've got to get 80% or better for your district to be classified, pass CUSAC and be classified as a high-performing district. I tell the boards, never, ever, ever let governance be the one area that you fall below 80% and you cause your district to be on that improvement list where you get all this nice Department of Education help for a year or two that you really don't want. So don't be the reason why your district governance is ever not on that high performing district list for CUSAC. But 14 indicators, the 13th indicator on your governance is about ethics. Three specific areas that get measured. It's an 8-point area, and there's no partial credit. You got to get all three if you want the 8 points. One, have all the members filed their personal financial statements in a timely manner. What does that mean? The veterans, April 30th every year, you have to have filed your personal and financial disclosure statement. I have to file as well. New Jersey School Board employees are under this act as well. So we have to do it by April 30th every year. If you're a newly elected board member, you have to file it within 30 days after taking the oath. Once you're a new board member, you take the oath, you get your disclosure statement filed within 30 days. Then you go on the April 30 cycle from that point on. The other item, second item is, has anybody on the board or any administrator been found in violation of the act? I.e., that it's gone through the process. SEC has recommended a sanction to the commissioner, and a person on this board or an administrator has received that sanction. That's number two. Number three is you're required to have an annual discussion about the School Ethics Act. That's what we're doing tonight. Two of those three, the ECS, who's responsible for CUSAC in every county, already knows the answers to those two because it's public record. They know if all of you filed your disclosure statements on time. They know if any of you have been found in violation of the act. So the only other thing they need is the objective evidence that you held your annual training at some point during the year. All right. Like I said, you got to get all three to get the 8 points. So the act itself established, it's focused on conflicts of interest. It established the School Ethics Commission. It also established the individual mandatory training requirements that you all have. The 92 Act put in place these financial statements, personal financial statements that we all have to file. And then the code of conduct for board members, those 10 tenets that everybody at reorg says we're going to abide by. They actually were not a part of the original act. The intent was to have a code of conduct for code of ethics for board members, but they didn't have them developed at the time that the legislature put the law in place. So what the DOE did, they reached out to New Jersey school boards and said, would you lead an effort to come up with a proposed code of ethics? New Jersey school boards reached out to the Superintendent's Association and the Business Officials Association, asked if they wanted to collaborate. They did. The groups worked and eventually developed the 10 tenets of the code of ethics. Submitted it to the state board approved it, and then it got incorporated into the School Ethics Act. That actually took 9 years to get that done. Mandatory training. You all have mandatory training at some point or another in your career as a board member. New board members, typical new board member, 3-year term. Your first year is governance 1. We call it new board member orientation. It provides a lot of the basic knowledge and skills that you need to get the wheels rolling. There's also 3 areas in the statute that board members are required to be trained in. You did one of them tonight, which was great. What I heard on the tail end looked like a real good presentation on harassment, intimidation, and bullying. Board members are required to be trained in it at least once in their term as a board member. So what New Jersey School Board does in our new board member orientation, that item is one of the sections that training is provided in. Also, CUSAC, new board members are required to be trained in the monitoring system of the state. And then the third item that there's a statute that requires training of new board members is within the first 6 months of being sworn in, a new member is required to have been trained in the evaluation of process of a superintendent. So all three of those, in addition to a bunch of other stuff, are covered in that new board member orientation. Second year, your second year of your first term, you take governance 2, which is finance and labor relations. A lot of information about finance. We include labor relations. Why? Because your budget, 80 to 90% of your budget is salary and benefits. So it's important that you all understand the impact of labor relations on the costs to your district. So both of those are combined as one mandatory training activity in governance 2. And then your third year, you're required to take your mandatory training in student achievement. That's the first 3 years of training. I call those the one and done. Once you take those 3, you usually never have to take them again. The exception would be if you left your board and moved to another town, and a couple of years down the road, you decide, you know what, I'm going to run for my new town's board. You get on. Then there's a question that usually we have to go ask the SEC about the gap. Depending on that gap, the SEC will make a decision on whether, well, this person's gap's too great. Therefore, they need to start all over and retake 1, 2, and 3. If they don't feel the gap is that big of a deal, from a length of time, then they'll tell us, nope, that person's okay. They can go to whatever next level they would have been if they had continuous service. So that's why I typically call those 1, 2, and 3 the one and done. And then every board member who gets reelected in the first year of your reelected term, you have governance 4, which is the legal educational update. Our legal department does a couple of hours of bringing you up to speed on anything that might be occurring or changed in education in the laws. So that's your mandatory training requirements. As I said, governance 4 is a recurring one. Every time you get reelected, you have the first year. The other 2 years, you get a break. You don't have anything in the latter 2 years of that term. You have basically 365 days to get your mandatory training done. True story. I've been doing this 7 years. My first 2 years, December 31st, the first year, December 31st, the second year, I had a board member, not the same board member, but a board member in a panic calling me because they're trying to get online to do the online training because they didn't get it done and they can't get into the system and they need IT help. You can imagine what my answer was, that, we'll see you after the holidays because there's nobody around that's going to be able to help you. Don't wait till the last minute. It doesn't take, it's a couple of hours and there are different opportunities for you to take it. Take it as early as possible, get it out of the way. You have, in a non-COVID world, you would have an in-person ability as well as a virtual, a live virtual type ability, as well as an online, log in, follow the program and take the course. We're not yet back to the in-person, but the live virtual is happening as well as the online. So there's different ways for you to take it that fits your learning style. What you need to do is go take a look at the mandated training page on NJSBA website. You can see all of the different methods for each of the different govs, what dates, and let your BA know what you want to do, and she'll register you and you're off and running, right? But you'll see in an upcoming chart, the SEC does not take kindly to folks who don't complete their mandatory training. They've been routinely increasing the number of board members that have been sanctioned, and larger numbers are getting actually removed from their boards for not completing it. So it's really not worth it. Doesn't take a lot of time. Recommend you get it out of the way. The SEC itself is a 9-member board appointed by the governor. Yeah, each person is appointed by the governor for a 3-year term. You can see the makeup by law, 2 boards, 2 school board members, 2 administrators, and then 5 non-school officials are on that commission. So they have a lot of authority over all of us. The 2 big things that are at the forefront that you hear a lot about are advisory opinions and ethics complaints. I tell board members the easiest way to remember it: advisory opinion before a violation of the act, ethics complaint after a violation of the act. Both of those, the DOE website, on the SEC site, there are instructions on how to request an advisory opinion and also instructions on how to file an ethics complaint. So let's talk about advisory opinions. Jesse Adams, board member. I'm thinking about doing something, taking an action, but I'm not quite sure if what I'm going to do may cause me to have violated the School Ethics Act. So I need to get some guidance. Where do I go? First place you go is Mr. Green, your board attorney. You follow your procedure, because I sometimes get myself in trouble when I say, go to the attorney, and people start, picking up the phone to call the attorney. You have a process on who is allowed to contact the attorney. By law, you have to have that process. And typically in your bylaws, it usually says, most bylaws I've seen, superintendent, business administrator, and the board president have automatic authority to contact the attorney. Anyone else needs to get permission, and usually that's through the board president. And the reason for that is most of you who've dealt with lawyers, you call a lawyer, what do? They hit that little clock, right? And they track that call, and then it goes into the invoicing department. That is, if a board member does that, you are obligating taxpayer dollars without authority. And that's why the law requires every board to have a process on how you get permission to speak to the attorney. So assuming, Jesse Adams needs to understand that, I go to my board president, tell him I've got a potential conflict. I need to talk and get guidance from the board attorney. Ben gives me the thumbs up. I make the phone call, talk to the attorney, get the opinion, and okay, it's not the opinion I wanted. I don't like the opinion. Maybe I need a second opinion. Where do I go? The SEC is your second opinion option. It can be your first opinion. We always recommend you're paying for the attorney, use your attorney first. But so you file a request to the SEC. That is a confidential communication between you and the SEC. You put the facts together, you send it to the SEC. They meet monthly and they review any requests. That part of that, that's not the only thing they do when they meet, but they do review any advisory opinion requests they get. They discuss it, they come up with a decision, and then they formally send a response back to the requester. As I said, that's a confidential communication. I like to call it a one-way confidential. The SEC isn't going to go around telling people that Ben asked for an advisory opinion. But Ben, who got an advisory opinion, is free to share it with board members, with others, that here's, in this situation, the SEC says it would be a violation. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, the law does allow the SEC that if they believe the facts of the case that's been presented to them, if any school official did what's in this advisory opinion request, all school officials would be in violation of the act. And school officials, by definition, are board members, superintendents, business administrators, and any other administrators who may have some type of financial responsibility. What do I mean by that? Let's say your BA establishes a blanket purchase contract with Staples, and authorized users of it are the principals and central office administrators. They can call up order things, and the bill will get paid. Because you now have those financial, that ability to obligate taxpayer dollars, you now fall under this act. So that's what, when I say other administrators, that's how they fall into this act. So if the SEC believes any school official who did whatever this request is asking for potentially could be violating the act, they can take a vote. And the law says if 6 of the 9 agree, they can release that advisory opinion as a public advisory opinion. Now, I just told you it was confidential. If you go and read the public advisory opinions, you don't know what town it came from. You don't know who the board member was. It's sanitized. All you see are the facts and then what the decision was of the SEC. When the SEC releases a public advisory opinion, it goes onto their website. There's a public advisory website with a whole nice long list of them. When a public advisory hits that website, it's an addendum to the law, basically. And if you do anything, if you violate it, if you do what's in any of those advisories, and the advisory said it's a violation of the act, you will have violated the act. And if you're sitting in front of the SEC in a hearing and you say, well, I never knew that was on the public advisory site, that's not going to hold water. I say, so all of us are required to know, even though we don't know when they're posting them to the site. But when I get to closing, I'll touch on how we, New Jersey School Boards, tries to keep you guys informed on those. But so there is a way for a public advisory to hit the streets. Ethics complaints after the fact. Anybody in the state of New Jersey who has the facts can file an ethics complaint against a school official. So if Jesse Adams down here, I live in Burlington County, if I have the facts on a board member up in Bergen County, all the way up at the tip of the state that I know about and I can prove, I can file an ethics complaint against that board member up in Bergen County. A lot of times board members believe that the only way someone can file an ethics complaint against them is if they live in their hometown where they were elected. It doesn't work that way. Anybody can file an ethics complaint against a school official. So if you do get a complaint filed against you, the SEC will contact you. You got 10 days to tell your side of the story. It's an option. You don't have to tell your side of the story. That's not going to make it go away. So you have an option to provide some information. You can also say, John Smith filed this against me. He and I have been, rivals because of a fence in our yard, and this is a frivolous suit. They take that serious. They will go and back to the originator and get more facts. If the SEC determines that it was a frivolous lawsuit, the law allows them to fine people $500 for a frivolous lawsuit. And they have been, over the last several years, they've been fining more and more people for frivolous law, because the intent is not to use the ethics complaint as a tool to get back at somebody. All right. So, but once they determine that there's enough here to move it forward into the process, i.e. start to take it through a hearing, that person who it's filed against, you are now in a legal process. And what I mean by that is if it goes through the initial process and the SEC determines that there's a violation and they recommend that to the commissioner and the commissioner makes the final decision and you're found in violation, if you want to appeal that decision, your appeal is to the appellate courts. So like I said, once that path starts and it's not immediately dismissed, you're in a legal process. All right. So if you are found to have potentially violated the act, here's what the SEC can recommend to the commissioner. The first level is a reprimand. I like to call that the slap on the wrist. You'll get a formal letter from the commissioner. It says, Jesse Adams, you violated the act on such and such a day. Here's the paragraphs and tenets of the act that you violated. Don't do it again. Censor is the reprimand on steroids. It's a public censor. If you get a censor, not only do you get your nice letter, but the state board is required to pass a formal resolution in the state saying Jesse Adams violated the act and all the particulars so that my name is forever in the annals of the minutes of the state of New Jersey. In parallel, the board that this person is from is required to also pass a formal public resolution stating that Jesse Adams violated the act, and in your hometown, you are forever in the minutes of the records of your town for having violated the act. So that's the public censor, which is the next level. The third level is a suspension. The SEC can recommend whatever number of days they believe appropriate based on the offense. And then the ultimate, they can recommend to the commissioner that the member be removed from the board. The commissioner, these are recommendations. They do all the investigation, the hearing, the legwork. They make a recommendation, but the ultimate decision is the commissioner's. So in theory, the commissioner could increase the penalty, reduce the penalty, or kick it out. I don't think that happens very often, but it's a possibility because the commissioner has the final say. And as I said, if you appeal, it's going to the appellate court. So let's take a quick look at what kind of activity occurred with the SEC in 2021. Advisory opinions requested. They had 20 advisory opinion requests. Of the 20, 9 were turned into public advisory. I don't have the information on them because they just recently, the SEC just posted the 9 to their website here somewhere around the end of January. Our legal department is going through all 9, and at some point in an upcoming school board notes, you will get information about what these new advisory opinions are warning us about. Mandatory training, I talked about the fact that you need to get that done. Every year at this time, basically first week in January, we are the New Jersey school boards in the statute. We are the organization required to manage mandatory training, do the training, keep the records, et cetera. First week in January, we run a report of all of the delinquent board members in the state. This year, it was about 200 and so board members. We basically, in January, what happened, the SEC would like the shortest list possible to deal with. So we always spend the month of January cajoling board members that it's really in your best interest to get it done. I was in a meeting today and they said the final list looks like it's going to be about 75 board members who ignored all the requests, and their names are going within the next few days to the SEC as the delinquency list. What's that? No, you wouldn't know by now. Well, you would know because you would have been contacted that you had completed it. And if you ignored that, you can just assume you're on that list. Last year, 30 cases went to the SEC. 7 board members were removed. 5 members received 30-day suspensions each, and 18 received reprimands. So it's not really worth the aggravation. What will happen is, if the list is 75, final list, it goes to the SEC, those 75 folks will receive a show cause letter from the SEC. Show cause letter is basically tell us, the SEC, why in 365 days you couldn't spend a couple hours getting your training done. That's basically, and so you need to have some pretty good excuses as to why you couldn't get it done in a full year. School ethics violations, there were 23 submitted to the SEC. Of the 23, 17 were dismissed. 6 were recommended to the commissioner, and I'll touch on those throughout the rest of the, those 6 throughout the rest of the presentation. So let's quickly run through the 10 tenets. Tenet A, pretty simple. You're the elected officials. Whether you like them or not, you have to uphold the laws, rules, and regulations of the state and the requirements set by the State Board of Education. You know, executive orders have been a hot topic, right? For the last couple of years. When they're issued, until they expired, they're law. Whether you like them or not, You're the elected officials. You have to enforce the laws. Tenet B, I tell boards all the time, this is why you're a board member. The focus here is your decisions need to be based on what's in the best interest for the educational welfare of all your students, regardless of ability, race, creed, sex, social standing. Nowhere in the act or in the code of ethics does it say anything about you're responsible for the adults in the community, stakeholders out there, taxpayers. Your responsibility is to the children. Everybody, every adult in your school district has a voice. If they're a teacher, they have an association that negotiates for them. There's issues, the association speaks for them. Whether it's a teachers association or administrators association, all of your associations serve as the voice for their members. Individual contracts like your superintendent, your business administrator, your assistant superintendents, those are direct contracts with the Board of Education. If they have an issue or concern, they speak for themselves. The only folks in this district who don't have a voice are the children. The Board of Education, you are the voice of the children. Your focus is, are we doing the right things for the children? That's got to be, always be your North Star, the children, not the adults. It's not about the adults, it's about the children. Tenet C, when we do roles and responsibilities, we tell boards all the time, there's four main functions of a board. 3 of them are right here. The other one I'll touch on later. They come out of the code of ethics. Policy, planning, and appraisal. We like to call it oversight and appraisal. You're a policymaking body. Some of you may have heard us talk about 2 words, what and how. You are the Board of Education, you are the what. You determine what you want for your district. You do that through your policies. Your policies tell the superintendent and his team what you want for this district. The how is the superintendent's responsibility. How do those policies get implemented? So the superintendent is responsible for the regulations, the operating procedures, the processes that are put in place to meet the intent of the board's policies, the what and the how. So you're a policymaking body. I know sometimes people get put on a policy committee and they think that's the worst committee to get stuck on. It's actually one of the most important ones for what you need to do to make sure your policies accurately reflect what you want as a board. Planning, the planning area is your responsibility. Setting district goals, doing strategic planning, budget planning. The budget process is led by the superintendent and the BA because they're doing all the work and bringing up, but it's your process. It's your planning process. You ultimately have to present a budget to the public at a public hearing and then take a vote. And hopefully that budget is meeting the vision that you have and providing the resources for the programs and the things you're trying to do for your children. So that's all part of your planning responsibilities. Appraisal. Superintendent has the responsibility for performance appraisals for every employee in the district by law. You, as a Board of Education, you have performance appraisal responsibilities for one person, the one person that you have the responsibility to hire, and that's your superintendent. Also, we also lump in that appraisal piece is the appraisal of the district, the oversight role that you have. Is the district being well run? In collaboration with your superintendent, are you looking at indicators that tell you where we're going, what we're trying to accomplish, or is making a difference for our students? That's part of your oversight responsibilities. And it's not, I like to use the airport example. You're in the tower. You see the whole airfield. You see the planes coming in, you see them taxiing out, you see the baggage carts moving around. You're not on the tarmac loading and unloading the bags, fueling and de-icing. You're not doing the day-to-day. you have that oversight. And that's the same principle that you need to understand. That's a separation of church and state here. You have oversight, your superintendent has responsibilities for operations and everything else that goes along with administering the district. Tenet D piggybacks right on that. You're not here to administer the school, but along with your fellow board members, you work together to ensure that the district is being well run. I will mention it, and hopefully you all know this, but by law, your superintendent is a board member. Non-voting board member, but in the law, it says the superintendent is a board member. So when I say Board of Education, I'm not talking about Board of Education, you all minus the superintendent. The Board of Education includes the superintendent who has a seat at the table. Tenet E, you speak with one voice. Your superintendent doesn't have 9 bosses. There's one boss, the Board of Education. All right, so you all speak as one voice, and that's important. You have a hot issue, hot resolution on the table, motion second, discussion. You have professional, good, clean, professional debate. And once the debate's over, you basically take the vote. And let's say that vote's 7-2 in favor. You know, the person who was one of the 2s might not be happy. And somebody catches them after the meeting, boy, yeah, that was a pretty hot issue. We saw you voted no on that. You know, what's up with that? Well, guess what? The board has spoken. Those 2, they're part of the board. So we like to tell them the appropriate thing to say, yep, I didn't agree with the decision. I had my opportunity to voice my concerns. I wasn't able to influence others, but the board spoke and I support the board decision and we move on. That is hard to do. There are a lot of people who have a hard time doing that, but whether you like it or not, even though you voted no, it's still your decision because you're part of the board speaks with one voice. All right, so it's important to understand, as a body, you have authority and power. Right now, you have an officially open meeting where you have a quorum, legally advertised, et cetera. You now have authority to make decisions. You have power. When your board president, first, second to adjourn, tap, 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 we're adjourned. You all are just John Q. Public again. You have no more authority than anybody who may come and sit in the audience. Like I said, this is when you have authority. But having been a board member, I know you walk around town with that big scarlet B on your forehead. Everybody knows, oh, there's a board member. They catch you in the supermarket. I've got a problem. You're a board member. I need to tell you about it. You need to avoid those kind of scenarios because you can't solve problems. We'll talk about that here with the last tenet that when we get to it, but you should not be making promises or taking private action that may compromise your fellow board members and the board. So this is the first of the 6 commissioner decisions from 2021. Board member on his personal Facebook page made anti-Muslim, racist, and incendiary and offensive comments. The district that this happened in was pretty ugly. The SEC looked at this and the individual did violate tenet E. They took private action that could compromise the board. Think of it in these terms. By making these, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim remarks as a board member, it's reasonable to assume that the community out there may believe that's how the board thinks. When you speak as a board member, people make the assumption, I guess that's how the board thinks. So there's a population in this town that may not feel comfortable coming to the board, coming to board meetings, et cetera. So it compromises the board. In this case, they issued a censor. The reason it didn't go higher is because it got so ugly in this town, the board member resigned before this case totally got through the hearing process. So the highest they could go was a censor to make it official, public, in the record, because they couldn't suspend them or remove him because he'd already resigned. Tenet F, you should not surrender your independent judgment to special interests or political groups. I will tell you, during this pandemic, we've seen a lot of board members violate this. And I won't say anything more about it, but it's something you need to understand. This is an apolitical body. There are no Democrats, Republicans, independents. This is an apolitical body focused on children. And it's important to understand that. And the SEC, the law says you need to leave that baggage outside of the room. All right. And it also tells you, you should not use your position on the board for personal gain for you or your friends. G is confidential. It's a two-parter. Confidentiality. We all know what happens in executive stays in executive until such time an item moves to the public agenda for your vote, for your action. If items that are confidential never come out of executive session and go to the public agenda, then they forever stay confidential. Right? So remember, the only people you should be discussing confidential information with is the folks sitting at the table, your attorney, your BA, and your superintendent. No spouses, no friends, no partners, et cetera, et cetera. You'll get yourself in big trouble. The second half of this is two-way communication. Yep. And what we mean by that is, and that's the fourth function of a board, two-way communication. In this, you're responsible for ensuring accurate information to the community. I had a board member say, well, what does that mean? Does that mean we now have to come up with our own newsletter or correspondence? And the answer is no. Boards of education, you're the top of the food chain. You communicate with the stakeholders every day. Superintendent sends a letter out to the community about a major event that's getting ready to happen in the district and inviting folks. Signs his name to it. Your BA gets a request from the township for some enrollment information. Pulls that together, puts a cover letter on it, she signs it, sends it all over to the township. Fourth grade teacher, we got a field trip coming up. She sends a note home to the parents saying, here's what each student needs to bring. Every one of those pieces of communication are Board of Education communication. Everything that comes out of this district belongs to you, whether you see it or not. So if you believe you have a communication process that stakeholders who need information, whatever that information is, when they reach out to the district, they get their information, you got a good process probably, right? If you think you need to potentially make some improvements, who do you talk to? Who do you think you talk to? Superintendent. You collaborate with your superintendent, come up with a couple of ideas to improve. The board says, yeah, we want to try these. Board has spoken, superintendent will make it happen. All right. The other piece is two-way communication, right? So you've got your outbound already happening. What's the inbound? You're responsible for understanding the aspirations of your community. You are the elected officials. You're the ambassadors for the district. You should try to understand what do the people out there want for the education of their children. And I'm not talking about the rumor mill, the Facebook posts. That's not what I'm talking about. All that other garbage that goes on out there. I'm talking about folks who may have legitimate ideas on ways to improve the district or what they would like, or have ideas on what they would like to see for their children. Those are aspirations. And you all, if you hear those things, you discuss those things, you see those things, you need to bring that back to your fellow board members and your superintendent. And that's where you have these conversations about what is your vision and are we meeting all of the aspirations that we know of that are out there? Are we in sync with where this community, where the stakeholders believe they want our children to go and this district to go? So that's your two-way communication responsibility. Second, commissioner decision, a board member distributed paper flyers urging voters to vote for a particular political party, indicating that the complainant was a leader of a radical group who is going to take over town government. The board member used his title as a board member and had no disclaimer. And I'll talk about what a disclaimer is in a couple slides. But in this case, the person put a flyer out and used his title as a board member as part of that flyer. All right. SEC took a look at that, and this person violated 3 of the 10 tenets. He took private action that compromised the board. So it's a political flyer, and using his title as a board member for that specific political party potentially could compromise the board. He also he surrendered his independent judgment to a political party. Now, you don't give up your right to be a Republican, Democrat, Independent, Green Party. You don't give up those rights because you become a board member. But there's a separation of that versus your board member responsibility. So you need to understand, he could have put a flyer out and said nothing about being a board member. And he would have been on solid ground. But because he crossed that line and tried to use his position as a piece of influence to the community, that's where he got himself in trouble. And then you're required to provide accurate information, communication piece. In this case, he was claiming someone was a radical leader, going to take over town government. The SEC kind of felt probably not real accurate information. So this person violated 3 tenets. Oops, let me go back. Yeah, and the penalty was a formal publicized censor. Tenet H? Yes, sir, go ahead.
So if you're acting as a private citizen and not at all talking about or using your board member position, is it still okay, like say canvassing for a political candidate?
Hold that question. In a couple slides, I will answer that.
Thank you.
All right. Tenet H, you have to appoint the best qualified people based on the, once you've received a recommendation from the superintendent. You can't do anything in personnel without the recommendation of the superintendent. But once you have the recommendation, then you have to make an informed vote. All right. I will support and protect school personnel in the proper performance of their duties. I tell boards all the time, board members should never, ever, 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 ever be heard saying anything negative about a staff member at any time in public. Per this tenet, you're here to support and protect the staff. Now, if you have a concern about a staff member, what do? Chain of command. Your chain of command for the board is a one-stop shop. It's the superintendent. You have a concern or you hear a concern, you bring it to the superintendent. You give that information to the superintendent and you're done. You've done your duty. Superintendent is the personnel manager, the disciplinarian, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in the district. That's part of his day-to-day administration responsibilities. So you've given the superintendent the information. You walk away, you're done. It's up to the superintendent in his role as the CEO and the personnel manager to take that information and do whatever he believes is appropriate. I also tell board members, once you give that information, don't expect to get a report back on, oh yeah, I investigated it. Person was definitely violating this. I'm going to recommend increment with whatever. That's not your role. It's information that you're not entitled to. That's administration. That's administering. So you've given the information, walk away from it, and you're done. Don't expect or demand the superintendent get back to you about what he might have done with that information. A board member, this is the third case, a board member at a public meeting threatened a coach's job and had done so in the previous year as well. Direct violation of the tenet we just talked about, protecting staff members. And in this case, the SEC suspended this member for 3 months. And then tenet J, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, this may be a minor point, but personnel. So let's say there's someone who's not on our staff, right? But a volunteer coach of something at some level. The same applies still.
The same applies.
Or a
because
vendor.
if they're, yeah, well, let me back up. Volunteer coaches, in my experience, in my districts that I served on and other districts I'm aware of, a volunteer coach is approved by the board. You know, nobody can just show up and volunteer and hang out with kids without your approval. So they, you know, volunteer coaches go through background, all that good stuff. So once you approve them, you should not be bad mouthing them, basically. Yep. Tenet J, the last tenet. This is important. You are required to refer all complaints and concerns to the chief administrative officer, your superintendent. And you are not authorized to act on those concerns until there's a failure of an administrative solution. Now, that sounds pretty bad. What it really means is somebody followed the chain of command, and for everyone but the Board of Education, the chain of command starts at the bottom, the lowest level, and works its way up to the superintendent. Someone has followed the chain of command, started maybe with the teacher, didn't like the answer, went to the principal, didn't like the answer, worked their way all the way up to your superintendent. Superintendent made a decision and they still don't like the answer. At that point in time, per your policy, person knows that they can request a hearing before the board because I'm not satisfied. That means the administrative process didn't resolve the issue for them. That's what failure of an administrative solution means. Just they followed the chain of command, didn't get satisfaction. They now want to take that concern to the board. At that point in time, superintendent typically will inform you that someone wants to have a hearing in front of the board. We'll brief you on all the particulars of it. Typically, when those hearings take place, we always recommend let your attorney run those. Let your attorney do the talking, ask the questions, get the information. Board members sometimes tend to put foot in mouth, which could open you up for litigation. So we always say, let your attorney deal with it, handle the hearing part of it. But then at that point, once that person has now legally, legitimately come before the board, you now have an opportunity as a board to address that concern. We also tell board to be careful, because typically the hearing takes place, board attorney says, thank you very much for bringing your concern to the board. The board will deliberate and the superintendent will notify you within 24 to 48 hours what the board's decision is. Board continues and the executive deliberates on it, and the board can overrule the superintendent because it's now in your court. We always tell boards, be very careful anytime you're going to overrule a superintendent's decision, because you do that too often, you send a message to the public about your superintendent. So we tell folks, be careful with that. Now, this also applies, like I said, this applies to that supermarket, right? When you get caught supermarket, somebody wants to complain, you need to say, really the appropriate process is for you to follow the chain of command. Your job is to help them understand how to use the chain of command. You should have your concerns. You have a policy that deals with how concerns and complaints are handled in the district. You should have that policy number memorized. And you should know the content, because that you should be pointing people who point them to that policy, help them understand how that policy works and how to use the chain of command. This also applies for public comment. Your public comment period. Person comes to the podium. Your meeting is a official government meeting held in public. It's not the public's meeting. Open Public Meetings Act says every government agency has to do their business transparently and hold their meetings in public. The public has a right to watch you. They have a right to watch you make the sausage. They can watch you stuffing the sausage sleeves, but they're not allowed to taste it, fry it, or do anything else. They just get to watch you make the sausage. The Open Public Meetings Act does have one caveat in it. It says every meeting, every government meeting must have at least one public comment period. Doesn't say public dialogue, doesn't say public questions and answer. It says public comment. your meeting, the public has the opportunity to come up and make a comment. We always recommend to board presidents, they make a comment, you thank them for their comment. If it's a concern, say something like, understand your concern. We've heard your concern. The board has heard your concern. Please make an appointment with the superintendent tomorrow so that he can further look into it. Because you as a board, per this tenant, you can't do anything about that concern of the person because it hasn't gone through the administrative process yet. So you need, but the public doesn't understand that. So they don't know why you're not talking to them, why you're not, so it's important for you to understand that per this, you can't solve problems until it goes through that administrative process and legally gets in front of you. So it's important to understand that. All right, so let me see. There is a board resolution to approve the hiring of the audit firm that you work for. Can you participate in the vote? Most of the head shaking, no, that's correct. And the reason for that is conflict of interest, right? Paragraph 24 in the act talks about conflicts of interest, and you can see some of the things that are listed from the act that could potentially cause you a problem with some of the actions you may take, some of the votes you may take. So you need to understand that. SEC's definition in the act for immediate family member is spouse or dependent child residing in the household. That was the original definition. Those of you who've been around since 2015, you know that with all these public advisory opinions that have come out, the SEC has opened that aperture. They've started using, they have been using the nepotism law, which has quite a few more relatives in that scenario. The remaining 3 commissioner cases all dealt with conflicts of interest. The first one, a board member voted to approve the superintendent's merit goals. The member's daughter was a tenured teacher in the district at the time the member participated in the vote. SEC looked at this, said it was a violation of the conflicts of interest paragraph in the act, specifically B, which basically said using your position to gain some kind of advantage or for yourself. What does that mean? Think about it. Superintendent's merit goals. We're going to approve them. If the superintendent achieves them, he's going to get a nice, bonus, so to speak. So if I vote yes and support that, maybe somewhere down the line, I may need a favor from the superintendent as it relates to my daughter, who's a teacher here. Quid pro quo kind of scenario. That's the potential conflict kind of things that the SEC is looking at. So in this case, this member received a reprimand. The second one, a board member wrote an op-ed endorsing a candidate for the Board of Education and included a disclaimer. And I'll talk about that, which will answer Mr. Rude's question when I get to it here in a minute. The op-ed included multiple references to his position on the Board of Education and a discussion and comments on board matters. SEC looked at this and said similarly, conflicts paragraph B, using his position to influence. And in this case, he's endorsing a candidate for the board and trying to let folks know that he used a disclaimer, but he made comments that I'm a board member, so you can take my word that this is a good candidate. All right. This person also received a reprimand. And then the last one, a board member voted to approve the use of district facilities to an organization from which he derived income. This was a violation of conflicts paragraph C, where he had a direct financial impact in this situation. This person also received a reprimand. Now you've seen in 2 cases the disclaimer. In one case, the person didn't use a disclaimer, and then one of the previous ones here, they did use the disclaimer. What is the disclaimer?
Mr. Adams,
Yes.
I apologize for the interruption. Mrs. Sugars and Mr. Avadia, it is now approximately 8:10. I'm just intervening with a time check that we have approximately 50 minutes left. I apologize, Mr. Adams, for the
No problem.
interruption.
The disclaimer comes from basically an old case, an old advisory opinion came out when I was a board member. And it dealt with a board member wanting to write a letter to the editor, newspaper. And asked for an advisory opinion, am I allowed to do that or do I lose my First Amendment rights? And SEC says, no, you, as a board member, you don't lose your First Amendment rights. But because you're an elected official, you have additional responsibilities. And what's meant by that is they talk about the disclaimer. So whether it's a newspaper or a Facebook post or a tweet, you're supposed to use, if you're a board member, you're supposed to use a disclaimer. And that disclaimer is basically saying, I'm a member of the Cherry Hill Board of Education. I do not speak on behalf of the Cherry Hill Board of Education. I am not authorized to speak on behalf of the Cherry Hill Board of Education. I am not speaking as a board member. I'm speaking as a private citizen, and these are my private comments and remarks. SEC says as long as you make that disclaimer, you're free to say what you want to say, as long as it's factual and doesn't breach confidentiality. The caveat, the kicker is in these cases, the one gentleman didn't use a disclaimer and kept talking about being in the flyer, I'm a board member. That's a problem. In the case where the person did use the disclaimer, if you're going to use the disclaimer, you can't talk about board stuff and you can't talk about being a board member in any comment because it defeats the purpose of the disclaimer. So to your question about, you know, what you can say, that's the issue. When you, because you're an elected official, you need to make clear if you're going to post or if you're going to send a letter, whatever you're going to do, you need to do that preamble. And then once you do the preamble, you need to stay away from anything relating to board business or identifying yourself any further as a board member. That's where these folks are getting themselves in trouble, trying to use the disclaimer, aha, I used it, but then they don't separate themselves from board versus personal. All right. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers my question, like in terms of like political. I do wonder, like with the social media, like, you know, Facebook, like it, should I disclaim when I post my Wordle results or
What's that? Say
or
again?
say that the new single from Taylor Swift sucks or is awesome? Like, what's
need-
the level of granularity there?
You need to understand that you are a board member, and when you post something, it has the potential of impacting the board because it's your opinion. People can infer, well, you're a board member, maybe the other board members think the same way. That's the situation you're in. That's why you all have additional requirements as it relates to your First Amendment rights to do, say, post, whatever you want to do. That's that extra burden you have being a well-paid board member. All right. Yes, sir.
So just along these lines, but more of a personal nature. So, you know, you have children in the schools. We have one employee. But nonetheless, we have to advocate for our own children.
Yep.
What's kind of the guidance? I mean, probably not dropping being a board member every second sentence is a good start, but like, how would you proceed?
You do not relinquish your rights as a parent because you become a board member. You do what you need to do to advocate for your children, to deal with your children, et cetera, et cetera. But you need to also understand your role. You're a board member. I'll use myself as an example. When I was a board member, board president and parent-teacher conference, I would come in, you know, at my assigned time with my wife and I to go in for a parent-teacher conference. And there's an elephant in the room, right? The board president has just entered the building and is sitting in a conference room with the teacher. And that's the elephant in the room. Personally, what I used to do and what my fellow board members on our board used to do when we had those situations, we broke the ice. I would say something like, you and I both know I'm the board president. That's not why I'm here today. I'm a parent and I need to figure out why my knucklehead son isn't doing what he needs to do, and I need you to be open and honest. And if nothing else, the word got back that board members who do that, the staff appreciated that because you address the elephant in the room because they're nervous. You know, they may have to say some things that they know you might not want to hear, but you're also a board member. So actually, this is how I operated, and how my fellow board members on the board I sat. That's how we agreed to operate. You all need to think about that just for your own personal sake. There is always going to be the elephant in the room when you're dealing with your child and your child's needs, et cetera. You want to make sure you don't combine those two, or allow the board piece to get into the equation, because that causes tension in the district, causes tension for that staff member, causes tension for your superintendent. All right. This last, a lot of social media cases are starting to pop up. Man, who'd have thought? This one was actually a dismissal. But the SEC, because of the nature of it, felt they needed to put a specific statement into this dismissal to the community, to the public. But the background is the individual made some pretty racist, insensitive remarks. Apparently, the thought is before he became a board member. Became a board member. A newspaper article came out after he became about some of these comments that were recorded that he did. Somebody filed an ethics complaint. In the investigation, in the hearing, they were unable to determine when those comments were actually made, whether they were pre or post being sworn in. The member said, I made these remarks. I'm not going to lie about it. I made all these remarks. I regret making them. I wish I never made them, but I didn't make them as a board member. So that was the argument. They could not prove, SEC couldn't, through the fact and all the hearing, prove that any of this occurred after the person was sworn in. So it ended up being dismissed. Every case is fact specific. So they couldn't prove it, therefore it was dismissed. But the SEC didn't want people to think, oh, this got dismissed. The SEC must agree with that kind of speech. What they did was they put this statement in that dismissal that said, the respondent is still a publicly elected school official who is charged with serving, among other things, the educational needs of a diverse, dynamic, and multifaceted student population. Public words which derogate from the mission of a board of education, serve no purpose, create unnecessary hostility, animosity within a community, and ultimately have the greatest detrimental impact on the very people that the respondent is tasked to serve, the students. Although the commission acknowledged the sanctity of the First Amendment, words that deliberately cause divisiveness should have no place in the educational setting. So they made it a point to put that in there. And bottom line is, if that has occurred during the board member side of the equation, that person would have had some pretty interesting sanctions against them. I'm not sure where it would have fallen, but it would have been at least a censure, if not more. So, all right. So bottom line, like I said, social media is getting to be a big ticket item. It doesn't matter what the medium is, whether it's Facebook, emails, the newspaper, Twitter, it doesn't matter. The rules are still the same for you as a board member. Right? Use the disclaimer and then live by that disclaimer. Ensure that your speech meets the act and the code. But bottom line, even if technically you can say my speech is perfect, the real question is it appropriate speech for your role as a board member? Is it divisive? Does it take away from the mission that you're here for, the children? If those are the kind of statements, it might be best to just leave that statement at home, right? So just think about it. Talked about conflicts. This is the nepotism law, and you can see all of the potential relatives that could cause you to have a conflict of interest. So you as a board member, you need to always be thinking, when I look at the agenda and there are actions I need to take, or is there anything here that I might need to recuse myself from and not be a part of the discussion? So it's important to understand that And for example, you had a brother who owns a landscape company, and he submitted your BA put out an RFP for landscaping services, and he submitted a proposal. That's probably one vote area that you don't want to be a part of. You want to recuse yourself because you have a potential conflict. But as you can see, spouse, partner by blood, marriage, or adoption, it's not just your relatives, it's a lot of other relatives that could potentially cause you a problem. Let's skip that. The big thing is that superintendent, based on the nepotism law, the superintendent cannot recommend his relatives or any of your relatives for employment in the district. If you have a relative in the district who was there before you became a board member, or before the superintendent's relative who was here before the superintendent became superintendent, those folks are allowed to continue their employment. The one issue is they're probably stuck in the position that they're in until they either retire or leave the district to go somewhere else. Because we had an advisory 2 years ago that covered this. Person, let's say they're an aide. They want to apply for a secretarial opening that pops up. They go through the interview process, and the principals all say, yep, this aide is now the right person for that position. That person doesn't get hired into that position until when? They show up on your agenda and you approve them. Well, if it's a relative of a board member or relative of a superintendent can't put that person on an agenda. So basically, the person who's an aide will always be an aide until the superintendent leaves, if that's their relative, or the board member leaves, if that's a relative, or they decide to leave the district. So that's the caveat. If you have a relative in the district, you cannot be involved, superintendent, or you cannot be involved in the personnel activities relating to that relative and the personnel activities of anyone in the chain of command to that relative. And the superintendent's top of the chain of command. So if you're a board member with a relative in the district, you're out of anything to do with personnel activities relating to your superintendent. Salary discussions, contract discussions, anything personnel related, you're out. You have to, and you can't just sit there and listen either. You have to physically leave the room, because usually those things are discussed in executive. You need to step out, right? Board is voting to approve the memorandum of agreement with the local education association. You're a teacher in another district. Can you participate in the vote? You live in Cherry Hill. You're on the board in Cherry Hill, but you teach over in Deptford. Okay, different. Your memorandum of agreement comes forward for the board to look at and approve. Can you vote? We've been told this is a trick question. Advisory opinion A2417 has a nice long table, and it covers all of these different permutations of different situations. But the example I just used falls under the second, on the first column, the second group of folks, spouse, dependent child. In that example, it was the board member themselves who works in the second column out of district. FCC has said they cannot participate in negotiations. There's a no in that column. But on the next column, can they vote to ratify the contract? The answer is yes. But there's a couple of asterisks there. After the memorandum of agreement, salary guides, and other compensation package items are attained. Think back to your negotiations. Memorandum of agreement, the hardest thing to get to, right? That's the bulk of everything you try to get to. That's not the contract. That usually has the percentage, what the benefits are going to be, what the terms and conditions you agreed on, any modification. That's what the memorandum of agreement is. The board typically reviews that, make sure the board is comfortable with that. But the contract itself includes the next step, which is got to develop salary guides. We got to take care of any other compensation items. You may have a coach's appendix that you have to deal with the stipends that you're paying. All of those things come after the memorandum of agreement. So when all of those other items are done, you package it up, that's the contract. At that time, that board member who's a school, a school district employee in another district now is able to vote on the entire contract. Not allowed, because you're still in negotiations, memorandum of agreement, salary, that's still all part of the negotiations. So that's, like I said, that table has a lot of different scenarios, depending on what, if you have that kind of an issue, you should go to that table, find where it fits you so that you know whether you can or cannot participate in collective bargaining. The doctrine of necessity, I don't think you have this, but if you had 9-member board, if you had so many board members that had a conflict that you could not legally take a vote. What do I mean by that? Personnel items. By law, personnel items requires the vote, the majority of the full membership. You're a 9-member board, your full membership is 9. Majority equals 5. So if 5 people show up for the meeting and 4 don't, you have a quorum, so you can run the meeting. You are now voting on personnel items. 4 vote yes, 1 votes no. That person doesn't get hired. Because you need 5 of the full membership. Even if the full membership doesn't show up, you still need, if 5 show, 5 of 5 have to vote for that to be approved. There are districts that have most of their board members conflicted. They invoke the doctrine of necessity every meeting, just so they can vote and do things. And there's a process. Your attorney runs that process, puts a resolution together, identifies the conflicts, gets the approval of the ECS. ECS approves it. Let's say you only have 1 item that you need that for. ECS approves it. Those conflicted members can vote on that 1 item. That's the purpose of the doctrine of necessity, so that you can make the legal vote that you're required to do. Volunteerism, all of you who've been around know that the rules through advisory opinions for what you can volunteer for in your district. I'm not talking about volunteering for the rec program or the local church. I'm talking about school district activities. What you can volunteer for depends, because of your role as a board member. Certain criteria have, that if you, for example, let me just say, dealing with children, you're a board member, you're not responsible to give direction to deal with children. Handling school monies, school, as a board president, as a board member, you should not be handling school money. Taking direction from staff, you're the top, you're the CEOs or the board of directors. Your executive role, you should not be taking direction from staff. Those are kind of some of the key parameters that the FCC looks at on what's a legitimate, safe volunteer activity for board members. A lot of confusion over the years. When our attorneys have done on this next chart, they put together a 7-question questionnaire and they provide the answers to the question. So basically, for every volunteer activity you like to do within your district, you should ask yourself these 7 questions as it relates to that activity. And if you get the same answers that are in green here, then it's an activity that you can continue to support and volunteer for. If you get a different answer to any one of these, then you need to have a conversation with your board attorney, because it's high, very high probability that's a volunteer activity that you cannot participate in. So this is a cheat sheet for board members that they put in there. So you all have a copy of this, I believe electronically, as well as some of you might have it in paper. So you have it to use if you need it. And then the last thing, interviews. Exit interviews, board members never get any information. They never participate in exit interviews. That's responsibility of the superintendent and his team. Other interviews, other hiring practices in the district, the SEC frowns on board members participating in any phase of the hiring process, other than when the recommendation comes to you at a board meeting. With the exception of one area, they said the one exception they've allowed is when you're hiring a, what they call senior type position, assistant superintendent, business administrator, those kind of senior executive positions, the SEC has said board members may participate in that process, maximum of 2, and if and only if invited by the superintendent. Superintendent owns the process. Superintendent says, I don't want board members in my assistant superintendent hiring process. It's superintendent's call. The board has nothing, can't change that call. And I can tell you, when this came out several years ago, I got a phone call from the board president. They were getting ready to interview for assistant superintendent. He was irate. And he said, we're going to be hiring an assistant superintendent. And the history in our district is that when a superintendent retires or resigns and goes to another district, we hire someone. We decide, interview our assistants, and we promote an assistant. We need to be involved in the hiring of assistants. And our superintendent telling us there's this new advisory opinion that says it's his call, not our call. And I said, your superintendent, 100% accurate. And he goes, well, what do I do? How do I make this happen? I said, you negotiate with the superintendent, but if the superintendent says no, it's no. And he was not happy with me because I didn't give him the answer he wanted to hear. But that's the realities of that. The only area that you're allowed to be a participant up to 2. And the other caveat is you as a board member, if you're invited, you have to follow the rules and the process that the superintendent has set. So he put you on a panel, he gives the rules of how what the panel's mission is. You got to follow those rules. You can't go rogue and do your own thing because you're on that panel now. So I talked about in the beginning of advisory opinions, when they hit the public website, we should know them. What our legal department does every month when the SEC holds their meeting, one of our attorneys attends to hear what's going on, but also to see if they're issuing any new public advisory. If they do, what our legal department does, they review that advisory opinion, and then they do an article in school board notes. Now, I know you guys get a ton of emails from school boards. Like I said, 22 years as a board member, I know you get a ton of them. And I'm always being told, I don't have time to read all this stuff, so I just don't. And I know because I used to dump it too. But what I will tell you is that if you don't read anything else, at least open school board notes, look at the table of contents and see if there's an advisory opinion up there. Because that's our way of letting the membership, board members, superintendents, business officials, etc., let you know that there's a new landmine that was put into the minefield. And so we try to give you as much information so that you're aware of it. So hopefully you don't make a mistake and step on that area. All right, so school board notes is your best friend as it relates to keeping up with what advisory opinions are hitting the street. The other thing we recommend this time of year, taking reorganization time is the perfect time, take an inventory of your roles in the district and out of the district, especially those that might be in education somewhere in the state of New Jersey. All right, take that inventory. We also recommend taking an inventory of all your volunteer activities that you do and what your role is. And we recommend you give those lists to your board attorney and ask for an opinion. When I was on the board and I was board president, that's what we did. We would do every reorg. Everybody would put their list together. We'd give them all to the attorney, and the attorney would give us written opinion on where everybody's conflicts were. And we shared it because as a team, we were able to make sure somebody didn't make a mistake or forget and get ready to vote on something that they probably shouldn't. So it was a way for us to avoid stepping on landmines and helping each other as a team, not to step on others. So just a recommendation that we get to boards. And I think with that, I'm done. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. In the file that you have on this presentation, in the last slide, there are 2 links. The first one is the link to the commissioner case. So if you really want to see what a full commissioner case looks like, what goes into all of those cases, and then some are on that website. The second link is the public advisory website. You go there and you'll see all the different advisory opinions, and they're usually under, they have some type of category that they're labeled. I can tell you that the 9 that were 9/20/21 advisory opinions that who knows why just got posted here in the latter part of January, that our legal department's reviewing those to put some information together. The 9 centered, 5 of those 9 centered on collective bargaining, negotiation and contracts, and then 4 of them were involvement in business and other ventures. So not sure what the particulars are, but those are the 9 that got dropped here at the end of January. So stay tuned to the school board notes. At some point, those 9 will be in an article with our legal guys giving everybody a heads up. So any other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
So first of all, thank you very much for this presentation. I think I've seen you do it. This is probably my 3rd time, and it gets better every time. Question for
Thank
newer school board members, but actually I don't know the answer either. When does someone pick up the phone and call you
Call me
as our rep?
anytime you want. For those who may not know, I'm your field rep. I have Burlington County, Mercer County, and half of Camden County. Terry Lewis has the other half. I've got about 70 boards that I have personal responsibility for. I am your consultant. I am your whatever you need. That's the purpose of field rep. Like I said, there's 9 of us in the state. We each have a territory. I get phone calls every day from board members, superintendents, and business management, and emails from the same. I mean, that's part of my responsibility. If you have a concern, you have a question, you need information, you contact me. If I don't have the answer, I have folks at headquarters I can reach back to get the answer. So that's part of my, so, you're free, all of you are free to contact me, anytime you need to. I will tell you, that is a confidential conversation that I have with board members, superintendent, VAs. That's a confidential conversation. And it's, again, a one-way confidential conversation. I will not tell anybody. I won't call Ben and say, hey, Ben, Jennifer called me. That will never happen. But Jennifer, you called, asked for some information. I gave you whatever you needed. You're free to come to the board and say, I spoke to Jesse about this item, and here's what he told us, blah, 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 blah. That's perfectly fine. I and NJSBA staff will not divulge who we talk to, but you are free to use the information we give you, anything that you want to use it for, share it with other members. That's perfectly fine.
Great. Now, if anyone does need the contact information, I mean, we all have it. So that's easy to get.
If you don't have it, let me know. I'll give you my business card. So, but if you ever need to figure out who I am, where I am, if you go to the NGSBA website, field services section, there's a nice little box at the top that says find your FSR. Put your school district in, hit enter, and my lovely face will pop up with my contact information. So.
Okay, any other questions or comments before we? Yes, Mrs. Dahl.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Jesse. It's very nice and thorough. I do have I don't think it's a question, but whether maybe it is, I don't know. How are you from Miss Gwyn Thornton? Who is Miss Gwyn Thornton? Are you is she part of the NJSBN Gwyn?
What's the name again? Gwen Thorpe? Oh, yeah. Gwen was your previous field rep. Let me give you historically, Gwen is up in Middlesex area. She's in central Jersey. She used to, historically, NJSBA had 2 field offices, one in Voorhees, one in somewhere up in North Jersey. Gwen, for years, worked in the Voorhees office, and her and the other field reps had South Jersey. Because Gwen was my field rep when I was on the board in Burlington County. So she had Cherry Hill, she had some Camden boards, et cetera. She moved to Central Jersey But historically, the board asked to keep her as their field rep. So historically, she continued to drive down here to serve you all. In December, I think it was in December timeframe, Gwen asked if I would mind if the board wanted me to pick up Cherry Hill, so she doesn't have to make that long commute anymore. So I said I was fine. I reached out to the board and board president, and vice president at the time, and they said, yeah, sounds good. So we officially, with our boss and everybody, we officially made the switch and updated the information. That's what happened. Gwen's still here. She's just all of our boards were up in central Jersey, with the exception of Cherry Hill, which was the one outlier that she had been holding on to by request of Cherry Hill. Now, if you don't want me, that's fine. I'll go get Gwen.
Well, thank you then
You're welcome.
for presenting us. Thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
I just have one question in terms of where do our ethics stop when it becomes like the community, well, they all know where we live and they come to our homes to do certain things or want to cause a ruckus even at your job or workplace. I operate under the rule of thumb is like, you came to my house, so I'm not a board member right now, but so I can respond accordingly. But what is the real ethics around that if we're not asking for that?
Well,
But
I think number one, yeah, I'd probably feel the same way if somebody came to my house and wanted to, come onto my property and deal with board business. But you do still need to think before you act and speak, because if they're coming and deal with board business on your front lawn, and you go out there and deal with board business as a board member, and you say or do something that is inappropriate, for them, they can say, ha, we got you. And we file that plan, and they film the whole thing, and you're, even though, yeah, I'm sure everybody's sympathetic, they came to your front lawn, but you didn't do what you should have done as a board member. So that's that, unfortunately, that's that burden you all have. I had it when I was a board member, that you always gotta think before you speak. Choose your words wisely, because in today's world, especially, people are filming everything that's going on. And if they capture you doing something or saying something that they can hold against you and point to the law, you know how people are, they'll do that. So I would just say you just need to be careful. But, like, I know what I would be doing if somebody came onto my front lawn. It wouldn't be, I said, we're not talking board business. I'd be dealing with it a different way. But so you're right. Those are the kind of things that in today's world, you just got to be careful of. But, you do have to protect yourself and do what you believe is right.
All right, thank you. One thing I do want to talk to you about after this, but for now, I will make a motion to adjourn. Do I have a second? Ms. Friedel, is a second. All those who agree, raise your hand. All right, we are adjourned.